The blizzard had been howling for 6 days, and the thermometer nailed to the pine tree read -28 degrees. Inside the cabin, built into the sandstone cliff, Nils Anderson moved comfortably in his shirt sleeves while his neighbors froze in structures that consumed 4 times the firewood and delivered a fraction of the warmth. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1841, and Nils Anderson had survived 7 winters in the Montana wilderness without serious injury or loss. This record was not common among trappers working the tributaries of the Yellowstone River. Most men who entered the mountains either died within their first 3 years or developed the hard-won competence that allowed them to survive indefinitely. Nils had reached that second category through careful observation, methodical preparation, and a respect for the wilderness that bordered on reverence. He was 34 years old, Swedish by birth, American by choice, and mountain man by necessity. His partnership with Henrik Strand had formed naturally during the winter of 1839, when both men had been working adjacent trap lines along a creek system that fed into the Yellowstone. Henrik was Norwegian, 10 years older than Nils, and possessed the kind of wilderness knowledge that came from 2 decades of continuous frontier experience. They had decided to combine their efforts rather than compete for the same beaver population. The arrangement worked well. Henrik understood animal behavior with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. Nils brought systematic organization and a talent for logistics that kept their operation efficient. Together, they ran one of the more productive trapping partnerships in the region. Their cabin stood in a meadow 200 yards from the main creek, positioned to provide easy access to water while staying above the spring flood line. The structure was typical of the era and adequate for their needs. They had built it in 5 days using standard notched log construction. The walls were chinked with moss and clay. The roof was bark and poles covered with a layer of sod. A simple door hung on leather hinges. One small window covered with scraped rawhide allowed dim light to filter inside. The dirt floor stayed cold and slightly damp, but they had grown accustomed to that. A central fire pit provided heat and cooking capability, though smoke sometimes filled the interior when wind conditions were unfavorable. The cabin kept out rain and reduced wind exposure. By the standards of men who spent most of their time outdoors, it was comfortable enough. Their routine followed the seasonal patterns that governed all mountain trapping operations. Autumn meant preparing the cabin for winter, cutting firewood, and stockpiling supplies purchased or traded at the autumn rendezvous. Winter meant running trap lines in brutal cold, processing pelts, and surviving until spring. Spring meant the intense final push of trapping season before beaver left their winter patterns. Summer meant the journey to trading posts or rendezvous sites to sell furs, resupply, and return to the mountains before autumn. The cycle repeated year after year. Men grew old fast in this life, but those who survived became wealthy by frontier standards. Nils and Henrik were on track for another successful season when January 1842 arrived with temperatures that would change everything. January 18th, 1842 began as an unremarkable winter morning. The temperature hovered near 0 degrees, cold but manageable by Montana standards. Nils and Henrik ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee before discussing the day's work. Henrik would check the northern trap line, a circuit of approximately 15 traps spread along 3 miles of creek and beaver ponds. Nils would process pelts from the previous day's haul and repair a section of their cabin's chinking that had cracked during the recent cold snap. They expected Henrik back by mid-afternoon. This division of labor had worked smoothly for 2 years. Neither man anticipated any problems. Henrik left shortly after dawn, carrying his rifle, knife, belt axe, and a leather bag for any beaver he retrieved from traps. He wore heavy wool clothing, fur-lined mittens, and mukluks insulated with dried grass. Nils watched him disappear into the pine forest, then turned his attention to the pelts stretched on willow frames inside the cabin. The work was meticulous and time-consuming. Each pelt required careful scraping to remove all flesh and fat without damaging the valuable fur. Nils lost himself in the rhythm of the work, occasionally feeding the fire to maintain enough light and warmth for detailed handwork. Mid-afternoon came and went. Nils began to feel the first stirrings of concern. Henrik was reliable about timing, rarely deviating more than an hour from expected return. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and temperature dropped, concern shifted toward worry. Nils prepared for a search. He loaded his rifle, gathered a torch, and put on his heaviest clothing. Just before full darkness, he set out along the route Henrik would have taken. The search lasted through the night. Nils followed the trapline systematically, checking each location, looking for signs of his partner. He found traps Henrik had already checked, evidenced by reset mechanisms and missing beaver. He found Henrik's tracks in the snow, clear and purposeful. But he did not find Henrik. As dawn broke on January 19th, Nils expanded his search pattern, moving in wider circles around the trapline route. The temperature had dropped further overnight. Nils's beard was thick with frozen condensation from his breath. He found Henrik 200 yards from their cabin at mid-morning. His partner had apparently finished checking the traps and was returning home when something went wrong. Perhaps he had fallen through thin ice crossing a beaver pond and gotten wet. Perhaps simple exhaustion and cold had overwhelmed him. The exact cause didn't matter. Henrik Strand was frozen solid, sitting against a pine tree, rifle across his lap, facing the direction of the cabin he had almost reached. He had died within sight of shelter, close enough that a strong shout might have carried to Nils working inside. But Henrik had not shouted, or Nils had not heard, and now his partner of 3 years was gone. Nils buried Henrik on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had run their most productive trap line. The ground was frozen, making the grave shallow, but Nils covered it with rocks to prevent animals from disturbing the body. He marked the site with a cross made from pine branches lashed together with rawhide cord. The work took most of the day. Nils spoke no words over the grave. He had never been a religious man, and Henrik had been similarly practical about mortality. The wilderness took men regularly. This was simply Henrik's turn. That night, alone in the cabin for the first time in 3 years, Nils could not sleep. The reality of Henrik's death played through his mind repeatedly, not with grief but with analytical precision. Henrik had been competent, experienced, and careful. He had not made obvious mistakes. He had simply encountered conditions that exceeded his body's capacity to generate and retain heat. The cabin had been close, visible through the trees, warm enough inside to sustain life. But Henrik had not reached it. The distance between survival and death had been measured in yards and minutes. Nils began examining the cabin itself with new attention. The structure that had seemed adequate now revealed itself as barely functional. Heat from the fire escaped through countless gaps in the chinking. Cold air infiltrated from beneath the door and around the rawhide window covering. The dirt floor conducted cold upward constantly. At night, when the fire burned low, interior temperature dropped to barely above freezing despite being enclosed. A man could survive inside, but only by burning enormous amounts of firewood and accepting persistent cold as normal. The cabin kept out wind and precipitation, nothing more. Over the following weeks, as Nils continued trapping alone to complete the season's work, he became fixated on the inadequacy of frontier shelter design. He began visiting other trappers' camps when his roots brought him near their territories. He examined their cabins with the attention of an engineer, though he had no formal training in construction or architecture. He saw the same patterns everywhere. Notched corners that created gaps and leverage points, minimal chinking that cracked and fell out, simple doors that warped and allowed drafts, bark roofs that leaked and provided minimal insulation. Every cabin he examined was built the same way because that was how everyone built cabins. Fast, simple, adequate for survival, but far from optimal. He found abandoned cabins and studied how they had failed. Corners showed damage where logs had shifted as notches compressed under weight. Door frames revealed stress cracks where green wood had dried and warped. Roof poles had rotted where moisture accumulated. The structures worked for 3 to 5 years, then required major repairs or complete rebuilding. Trappers accepted this cycle as inevitable. Build quickly, use until it fails, build again. But Nils began wondering if there was a better approach. Spring arrived gradually in the high country. Snowmelt swelled the creeks, and beaver became more active in the warming water. Nils worked his trap lines with mechanical efficiency, processing pelts and preparing for the journey to sell his furs. The work kept his hands busy but did nothing to quiet the questions circulating through his mind about shelter, heat retention, and survival. He had begun carrying a small journal, recording observations about how different structures and materials responded to temperature changes. Other trappers would have considered this strange behavior, so Nils kept his investigations private. In late April, a spring storm moved through the region with unexpected intensity. Nils had been checking traps several miles from his cabin when dark clouds built rapidly overhead. Within an hour, heavy rain mixed with sleet began falling, driven by wind that made travel dangerous. Nils needed shelter immediately. The nearest structure was his own cabin, but it was too far to reach safely in the storm. He remembered a massive sandstone cliff formation he had noticed during earlier explorations. The formation featured a deep overhang that might provide adequate protection. He headed toward it. The overhang was even better than he remembered. The sandstone shelf extended outward approximately 20 feet from the vertical cliff face, creating a protected alcove large enough to shelter a dozen men. The space beneath the overhang was dry despite the storm raging outside. Wind could not penetrate directly. Rain fell several yards away from the back wall. Nils gathered deadwood from the protected area and built a small fire against the stone back wall. The fire caught quickly, and he settled in to wait out the storm. As hours passed, Nils noticed something remarkable. The sandstone wall behind his fire was warming noticeably. He could feel heat radiating from the rock when he held his hand near it. This seemed normal enough while the fire burned. But as evening approached and the fire burned down to coals, the stone continued radiating warmth. Nils let the fire die completely, expecting the cold to return rapidly. Instead, the stone wall remained warm to the touch for hours after the last ember faded. The massive rock formation had absorbed heat throughout the afternoon and was now releasing it slowly back into the sheltered space. Nils spent the night under the overhang, building only 2 small fires to maintain comfort. In a standard cabin, he would have needed continuous fire through the night to avoid freezing. Here, the stone itself was working as a heat source, requiring no fuel and no maintenance. The warmth was gentle but persistent, exactly the kind of steady heat that made the difference between comfort and suffering during long winter nights. As dawn broke and the storm cleared, Nils sat staring at the sandstone wall, his mind racing with possibilities he had never considered before. Nils finished his spring trapping season and left the mountains in early June 1842 with a load of beaver pelts packed on 2 horses. The journey to St. Louis took 3 weeks following established trails through South Pass and down the Platte River route. Other trappers traveled in groups for safety and companionship, but Nils preferred solitude during the long ride. The travel time gave him space to think without interruption. His mind kept returning to the sandstone overhang and the way stone had held heat for hours after his fire died. St. Louis was chaos compared to the wilderness. The city had grown rapidly as the jumping-off point for western migration and trade. Steamboats crowded the Mississippi riverfront. Warehouses lined the commercial districts. The streets were thick with traders, merchants, immigrants, and mountain men in from the frontier. Nils sold his furs to a reputable buyer and received a fair price. The transaction put nearly $300 in his pocket, enough to support himself comfortably for a year if he lived modestly. Most trappers would have spent the money on whiskey, gambling, and entertainment before returning to the mountains. Nils had different priorities. He spent 2 weeks studying buildings with the focus of a man preparing for an examination. He watched masons constructing a brick warehouse, paying particular attention to how they laid courses in overlapping patterns that distributed weight and created structural strength. He examined stone foundations, noting how massive weight transferred through properly placed supports. He visited a cooperage and observed how barrels were assembled using interlocking staves and compression hoops. Each trade had specialized knowledge about materials and joinery that most people never noticed. Nils asked questions constantly. Some craftsmen ignored him. Others, pleased to find someone genuinely interested in their work, explained their techniques in detail. He purchased supplies that other trappers would have considered wasteful or unnecessary. 20 pounds of horsehair from a tannery that processed cattle hides. The hair was a byproduct normally discarded or sold for stuffing furniture. Nils paid premium price for clean, long strands. He bought clay from a pottery supplier, explaining he needed material that would remain flexible when mixed with other compounds. He purchased pine resin from a ship chandler who supplied caulking materials for boat builders. The chandler assured him the resin would create waterproof seals if properly prepared. He bought a mercury thermometer, an expensive precision instrument rarely seen on the frontier. The seller asked what possible use a trapper had for such a device. Nils simply said he wanted to measure temperature accurately. His most important purchase was information. He spent evenings in taverns frequented by builders and craftsmen, buying drinks and listening to conversations about construction challenges. He learned about thermal mass, though no one used that specific term. He heard masons discuss how thick stone walls moderated interior temperature in both summer and winter. He listened to a German immigrant describe root cellars built partially underground that stayed cool in summer and prevented freezing in winter. Every conversation added pieces to the solution forming in his mind. Nils returned to the Montana wilderness in late July 1842 with his unusual supplies packed carefully on 3 horses. The extra animals were necessary to transport the weight of materials he had purchased. Other trappers he encountered on the trail looked at his load with confusion. Horsehair, clay, resin, and a thermometer made no sense as trapping supplies. Nils offered no explanations. He had learned that describing his plans would only invite mockery before he had proven anything. Better to build first and explain later if the idea worked. He did not return to the cabin he had shared with Henrik. That structure held too many memories and represented methods he now intended to abandon. Instead, he began searching for a specific geological formation. He needed a sandstone cliff with a substantial overhang, south-facing orientation for maximum sun exposure, and enough elevation to provide clear sight lines and drainage. The formation also needed to be near water, but not so close that spring flooding would threaten the site. He spent 3 weeks exploring the region on horseback, examining dozens of cliff faces and rock formations. The cliff he finally selected stood in a remote valley 15 miles from his old territory. The sandstone formation rose nearly 80 feet from the valley floor, weathered into horizontal layers that created natural shelving. Approximately 40 feet above ground level, a massive overhang extended outward 25 feet from the vertical cliff face. The overhang was thick, at least 10 feet of solid stone, forming a natural roof. The space beneath was roughly 30 feet wide, carved by thousands of years of wind and water erosion into a smooth alcove. The floor was relatively level, composed of the same sandstone as the cliff itself. The site faced south-southwest, meaning it would receive maximum sun exposure during winter months when low-angle sunlight would penetrate deep into the alcove. The elevation provided natural drainage, ensuring that snowmelt and rain would flow away from the structure rather than pooling around it. A clear creek ran 200 yards downslope, close enough for convenient water access, but far enough to avoid flood risk. Scattered pines provided timber for construction and firewood. The surrounding terrain offered good visibility in all directions. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they reached the cliff. Nils spent 2 days at the site, observing how sunlight moved across the rock face throughout the day, watching where wind came from and how the overhang deflected it. and testing the stone's composition by building small fires against the cliff and measuring how long the rock retained heat. The sandstone performed exactly as he hoped. It absorbed warmth readily and released it slowly over many hours. The overhang created a microclimate beneath it, noticeably warmer and calmer than the exposed areas just yards away. This was the location. Everything he had imagined during his time in St. Louis could be tested here. He began planning the construction process in detail. News of Nils Andersson's construction project spread through the scattered trapping community with surprising speed. The wilderness seemed empty, but information traveled efficiently through the network of men who crossed paths at creek junctions, shared campsites, and trading posts. By late August, several trappers had heard that the Swedish trapper who had lost his partner was building a cabin in a strange location using strange methods. Curiosity brought visitors to the cliffsite where Nils had begun clearing the alcove floor and organizing his materials. Obadiah Webb arrived first. Webb was an English trapper in his mid-40s who had worked the region for nearly 2 decades. He considered himself an authority on frontier construction and survival techniques. He rode up to the cliff base, studied the overhang from horseback, then dismounted and climbed the slope to where Nils was chipping away irregular protrusions from the stone floor. Webb examined the site with growing disbelief. He walked the length of the alcove, looked at the supplies Nils had organized, and finally spoke the question that would be repeated many times over the following weeks. "You're building into a cave like a savage?" Webb's tone mixed amusement with genuine confusion. "This is what you're doing instead of building a proper cabin down by the water like a civilized man?" Nils continued his work, using a heavy chisel to level a section of stone. He explained calmly that the overhang would provide a natural roof and back wall, eliminating substantial construction work. Webb laughed outright. "You're still building 3 walls and hauling all your timber uphill. You'd save more effort just building normal down in the meadow." He gestured toward the valley below, where a cabin could be positioned near the creek. More trappers visited over the following weeks as Nils began the actual wall construction. Each arrival brought similar reactions. Some thought the cliff location was dangerous, certain that rockfall would eventually crush anyone living beneath the overhang. Others considered it primitive, associating cave dwelling with desperate men or indigenous peoples rather than successful trappers. Several pointed out the difficulty of hauling water uphill daily. A few questioned the ventilation, convinced that smoke would trap under the stone ceiling and suffocate anyone sleeping inside. None understood what Nils was attempting to achieve. The criticism that stung most came from men who claimed to appreciate his carpentry skill while missing the underlying purpose entirely. They would examine his careful log selection, his precise fitting, his specialized chinking mixture, and compliment his craftsmanship before adding that all that effort was wasted on a fundamentally flawed location. "Beautiful work," one trapper said, running his hand along a perfectly fitted log joint. "Shame you're doing it inside a cave where nobody will see it, and you'll probably die from rockfall or smoke." Nils stopped explaining his reasoning after the first few attempts, met with blank stares or patronizing nods. He simply continued building, methodical and focused, while the trapping community watched with amused skepticism and growing certainty that the Swedish trapper had lost his mind after his partner's death. The most technically challenging aspect of Nils's construction was sealing the junction between his log walls and the irregular sandstone cliff face. Standard log cabin construction involved fitting round logs against other round logs, a process with well-established techniques. Fitting round logs against an uneven stone surface presented problems that no traditional frontier carpentry addressed. The sandstone back wall was not perfectly vertical. It curved and bulged in places, receded in others, and featured surface irregularities ranging from subtle undulations to protrusions several inches deep. Any gaps between the logs and stone would create air infiltration points that would destroy the cabin's thermal efficiency. Nils began by mapping the stone surface carefully. He used a plumb line to identify the general vertical plane, then marked high points and low points along the entire back wall where his cabin would attach. This process took 3 full days. He measured, marked with charcoal, and remeasured, creating a detailed understanding of exactly how his logs would need to conform to the stone. Other trappers building standard cabins would have completed entire structures in this time frame. Nils was still studying his foundation junction. He selected logs for the back wall based on their natural curve and taper. Every tree grows with slight irregularities. Most builders ignored these variations or worked to minimize them. Nils specifically chose logs whose curves would complement the stone wall's contours. A log with a gentle inward curve might fit perfectly against a section where the stone bulged outward. He spent 2 weeks cutting and transporting logs, rejecting dozens of perfectly good timbers because their shape did not match his requirements. The process seemed obsessive to anyone watching, but each log was selected to solve a specific geometric problem. The actual fitting process required custom work on every single log. Nils used his tools to shape the back edge of each log where it would meet stone. He carved away wood in some areas to accommodate stone protrusions. He left wood proud in other areas to bridge gaps where the stone receded. Each log received hours of individual attention, fitted and test-fitted repeatedly until the contact surface matched the stone contour with minimal gap. The work was exhausting and slow. A single log might require an entire day to shape and position correctly. The chinking mixture Nils had prepared in St. Louis became critical at this junction. His combination of clay, horsehair, and pine resin created a material unlike anything used in standard frontier construction. The clay provided bulk and moldability. The horsehair acted as reinforcement, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. The pine resin contributed waterproofing and adhesive properties that helped the mixture bond to both wood and stone. Nils prepared the compound by heating the pine resin until it became liquid, then mixing it thoroughly with dampened clay and chopped horsehair. The result was a thick, sticky material that could be packed into irregular gaps and would cure into a flexible, durable seal. He applied the chinking while it was still warm and pliable, packing it into every gap between log and stone with methodical completeness. The back wall junction consumed nearly 3 weeks of intensive work before Nils was satisfied that the seal was complete and airtight. With the back wall junction complete, Nils turned his attention to the exposed walls that would face the elements. The right side wall and front wall required different thinking than the stone junction. These surfaces would bear the full force of wind, rain, and temperature extremes. They represented the primary heat loss surfaces of his structure. Every decision about their construction focused on creating maximum thermal efficiency while maintaining structural integrity. Standard frontier cabins treated walls as simple barriers against weather. Nils designed his walls as thermal envelopes. Log selection for these walls followed criteria even more stringent than the back wall. He wanted logs of consistent diameter, approximately 12 inches, with minimal taper from base to top. He rejected logs with significant irregularities, splits, or rot. Each log was stripped completely of bark using his draw knife, a process that required hours per log but eliminated the irregular gaps that bark created. The stripped logs were then shaped on their top and bottom surfaces to create flatter contact areas. This shaping was subtle, removing perhaps half an inch of wood, but it allowed logs to nest together more tightly than round-on-round contact permitted. The corner where the front wall met the right side wall received special attention. Nils had observed during his St. Louis education that corners were structural weak points in most buildings. Traditional notched log corners created leverage points and gaps that compromised both strength and thermal performance. He decided to use a different technique, one he had seen in higher quality construction but never in frontier cabins. He extended each log approximately 2 feet past the corner intersection, creating overlapping extensions on both walls. Then he drilled vertical holes through multiple log layers simultaneously and drove iron pins through the holes, pinning 3 or 4 logs together in a rigid assembly. The technique was labor-intensive and required careful drilling to keep holes aligned through multiple logs, but the result was a corner that could not be disassembled by force. The extended logs also eliminated the leverage point that bears or other threats could exploit to tear corners apart. The corner became the strongest part of the wall rather than the weakest. Nils built 4 such pinned corners, 1 at each junction of his 3 walls. The corners alone required a full week of work, but their strength justified the investment. The door represented perhaps the most critical component of the exposed wall system. Standard cabin doors were assembled from whatever planks were available, hung on leather hinges, and secured with simple wooden bars. Nils spent 2 full weeks building his door. He selected a single large pine with dense, straight grain and hewed planks 3 inches thick. The planks were fitted using tongue and groove joints he carved by hand, creating a door that was effectively a single piece of wood. He reinforced the interior face with iron brackets arranged in an X pattern, bolted through the planks with square-cut nails that were clinched over on the exterior side. The completed door weighed nearly 90 pounds, but was rigid enough to support its weight without warping. The most radical aspect of Nils's design became apparent as the walls rose to their full height. Every trapper who visited the construction site eventually asked the same question: when would he start on the roof? Nils would gesture upward at the massive sandstone overhang and explain that the roof was already complete and had been for thousands of years. The responses ranged from confusion to outright disbelief. The concept of using natural geology as structural architecture was so foreign to frontier building conventions that many visitors could not process what they were seeing, even when it was directly explained. Traditional log cabin roof construction was one of the most labor-intensive aspects of building. It required cutting and hauling ridge poles, splitting or hewing roof planks, gathering bark for waterproofing, and often digging and transporting sod for insulation. A standard roof might require 3 or 4 days of hard work by 2 men. The roof also represented a significant maintenance burden. Bark deteriorated and needed replacement every few years. Sod grew heavy when wet and required periodic replacement as vegetation died and soil eroded. Roof poles rotted where moisture accumulated. Most cabin roofs leaked at least occasionally and needed constant attention to remain functional. Nils's sandstone overhang eliminated all of this work and all of this maintenance. The stone shelf extending 25 feet from the cliff face was at least 10 feet thick, solid rock that had weathered natural erosion for millennia without collapse. The overhang's underside was relatively smooth, weathered into gentle curves by wind and water. The stone was completely waterproof, absolutely fireproof, and would last indefinitely without any human intervention. The weight-bearing capacity exceeded anything wooden construction could achieve. A man could have driven a loaded wagon onto the top of the overhang without risking structural failure. But the thermal properties were what made the natural roof genuinely revolutionary. Wooden roofs provided minimal insulation. Heat from interior fires rose and escaped through the wood, bark, and sod relatively quickly. Cold from winter air penetrated downward through the same materials. The roof was a major thermal loss surface that required constant fire to compensate. The sandstone roof functioned completely differently. Stone has high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During the day, when Nils would burn fires for cooking and warmth, heat rising from the cabin interior would warm the stone ceiling. The massive thickness of rock would absorb this heat throughout the day, storing it in the stone's molecular structure. At night, when fires burned low or went out entirely, the warmed stone would begin releasing the stored heat back downward into the cabin. The process was slow and steady, exactly the kind of gentle, sustained heat release that made the difference between freezing and comfort during long winter nights. The stone ceiling was not just a roof. It was a thermal battery that would charge during the day and discharge at night, providing passive heating that required no fuel and no maintenance. This concept was so far beyond standard frontier understanding that Nils stopped trying to explain it. Nils completed the basic construction in mid-September 1842, just as autumn temperatures began their steady decline toward winter. The cabin had consumed nearly 2 months of intensive work, far longer than any standard frontier structure required. He moved his supplies and equipment into the finished space and began the process of learning how his creation actually performed. The interior measured approximately 20 feet wide by 18 feet deep, larger than most solo trapper cabins. The height varied from 7 feet at the front wall to nearly 12 feet at the back, where the natural stone ceiling arched upward. He built a stone fireplace in the corner, where the front wall met the left side wall junction with the cliff. The fireplace construction took another week, using flat stones gathered from the creek bed below. He designed the firebox to be relatively small, understanding that excessive fire would waste wood and create uncomfortable heat in such a well-sealed space. The chimney extended upward along the cliff face, exhausting smoke well away from the overhang opening. The design created excellent draft, pulling smoke efficiently from the firebox and preventing any interior accumulation. As September gave way to October and nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing, Nils began noticing the cabin's thermal behavior. His evening fires were smaller than he had burned in his previous cabin, perhaps 1/3 the size, yet the interior remained noticeably warmer. He attributed this initially to superior chinking and the tight door seal eliminating drafts. Standard cabins leaked air constantly. His cliff cabin was genuinely airtight, with minimal infiltration even during high winds. The difference in comfort was immediate and obvious. But as October progressed and he spent more time living in the completed structure, Nils realized something else was happening. The warmth persisted long after his fires burned down to coals. In his old cabin, letting the fire die meant rapid temperature drop, often waking in near-freezing conditions by dawn. In the cliff cabin, he would bank the fire before sleeping and wake 8 hours later to an interior that remained comfortably warm. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between sleeping under multiple heavy blankets and sleeping under a single wool blanket. The difference between waking to frozen water in a bucket and waking to liquid water, the difference between comfort and endurance. He began using his thermometer to track interior temperature, taking readings at different times of day and night. The data confirmed what his body already knew. Interior temperature remained remarkably stable, varying perhaps 10 to 15 degrees over a full day-night cycle. Even when exterior temperature dropped to 0 degrees, interior temperature stayed above 40 degrees with only minimal fire. When he maintained a small fire through the evening, interior temperature would climb to 60 or even 65 degrees and remain there through the night. Nils did not yet understand the full magnitude of what he had built. He knew the cabin worked better than standard construction, but he assumed the difference was incremental rather than revolutionary. He would not fully comprehend the breakthrough until winter arrived with its genuine tests of survival and thermal efficiency. December 1842 brought the first serious cold of winter. Temperature dropped to -15 degrees during a week-long cold snap that tested every structure and every man in the high country. Nils had prepared for winter by cutting and stacking firewood, a task that consumed most of November. Based on his previous winters, he estimated needing approximately 4 cords of wood to survive until spring. He had cut 6 cords to provide a comfortable margin. The woodpile stood near the cabin entrance, easily accessible even in deep snow. The cold snap began on December 9th with clear skies and plummeting temperature. Nils woke to -10 degrees and watched the thermometer drop further throughout the day. By evening, exterior temperature had reached -15 degrees. He built his evening fire as usual, a modest blaze that brought interior temperature to approximately 60 degrees. He ate dinner, tended the fire until it burned down to a solid coal bed, then banked it with ashes and went to sleep around 9 in the evening. Standard frontier practice would have required waking multiple times during the night to feed the fire and prevent interior temperature from dropping dangerously low. Nils slept through the night without waking. When he rose at dawn, he checked the thermometer immediately. Exterior temperature had dropped to -18 degrees during the night. Interior temperature stood at 52 degrees. The fire was completely out, reduced to cold ashes. Yet the cabin remained warm enough that Nils could move around comfortably without immediately rebuilding the fire. He dressed, made coffee, using tinder and kindling to restart the fire, and sat thinking about what had just happened. In his previous cabin, with exterior temperature at -18 degrees and no fire, interior temperature would have been perhaps 5 or 10 degrees, barely above exterior. Water would freeze solid. Breath would create ice crystals in the air. A man would wake shivering violently, forced to restart the fire immediately just to survive. Yet here, in the cliff cabin, with the fire completely dead for hours, interior temperature had dropped only to 52 degrees. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between survival and comfort, between enduring winter and living through it normally. The cold snap lasted 7 days. Nils continued his experiment, carefully tracking firewood consumption and temperature readings. Over the full week, he burned through approximately 1/4 cord of wood. During previous winters in standard cabins, a week of negative temperatures would have consumed 2 full cords, sometimes more. He was using 1/8 the firewood and staying dramatically warmer. The mathematics were undeniable but seemed impossible. He began understanding that the stone was not just reflecting heat or blocking wind. The massive sandstone formation was storing thermal energy during the day when he burned fires and releasing that energy slowly throughout the night. The cliff itself was functioning as a heating system that required no fuel and no maintenance. The realization was profound, but also isolating. He had no one to share this discovery with, and he knew that explaining it would only invite more mockery from men who had already decided his cliff cabin was foolish. November 1843 arrived with early snow and temperatures that dropped faster than normal seasonal patterns predicted. Nils had spent the intervening year trapping successfully, refining his understanding of the cliff cabin's thermal behavior and making minor improvements to the structure. He had added a second small window on the right side wall for additional light and ventilation during warmer months. He had built interior shelving and a proper sleeping platform that kept him well off the stone floor. He had developed routines for fire management that maximized the stone's heat storage while minimizing wood consumption. The cabin had become genuinely comfortable, perhaps the most livable space in the entire region. He had also maintained silence about the cabin's performance. When other trappers asked how his strange cave dwelling was working out, Nils responded with vague pleasantries about staying warm enough and having no complaints. He did not mention his firewood consumption, which remained a fraction of what others burned. He did not discuss interior temperature readings or the stone's thermal mass properties. He had learned that revolutionary ideas are not believed until proven through crisis, and he had no desire to endure more mockery while waiting for that proof to arrive. Obadiah Webb visited in late November, ostensibly to discuss trapline territories, but actually driven by curiosity about whether Nils had survived a full year in his cliff structure. Webb arrived in the afternoon, climbed to the cabin, and was invited inside for coffee. The interior was noticeably warm, despite the small fire burning in the fireplace. Webb commented on this immediately. "You must be burning through wood like a man made of money," he said, assuming the warmth required excessive fuel. Nils gestured toward the window where his woodpile was visible. "I've burned perhaps a cord since September," he said quietly. Webb stared at him with open disbelief. "Impossible. I've burned 3 cords already, and barely keep my cabin above freezing most nights." Nils simply shrugged and poured coffee. Webb examined the interior more carefully, noting the tight construction, the specialized chinking, the quality of the door and window. "Fine work," he admitted, "but you can't be burning only a cord. You're lying, or you've got some other heat source you're not mentioning." The accusation hung in the air. Nils did not argue. He knew that no explanation would convince Webb without direct evidence, and that evidence would only come during extreme conditions. Webb left an hour later, still convinced that Nils was either lying about his wood consumption or had discovered some trick he was keeping secret. The interaction reinforced Nils's decision to remain quiet about his cabin's true performance. Other trappers visited occasionally through early winter, always commenting on the interior warmth, always assuming it required excessive firewood, always leaving skeptical when Nils claimed otherwise. The pattern repeated itself enough times that Nils stopped offering any explanation at all. He simply lived comfortably in his stone-backed cabin and waited for winter to make his case for him. January 1844 began with weather that seemed typical for the high country. Cold, clear days alternated with light snow. Temperatures stayed consistently below zero, but not dangerously so. Trappers worked their lines, processed pelts, and managed their firewood supplies with the routine efficiency of men accustomed to mountain winters. Then, on January 14th, the sky changed. A massive weather system moved in from the northwest, bringing clouds that turned the afternoon dark as evening. By nightfall, the blizzard had begun in earnest. The storm was catastrophic from the first hours. Wind reached speeds that made travel impossible, and visibility dropped to arm's length. Snow fell so heavily that accumulation could be measured in feet per day rather than inches. Temperature plummeted to -30 degrees, then -35, sustained cold that exceeded anything the region had experienced in years. Trappers retreated to their cabins and focused entirely on survival. Running trap lines became impossible. Leaving shelter for any reason became potentially fatal. The storm settled in and showed no signs of weakening. Obadiah Webb's cabin stood in a meadow 4 miles from Nils's cliff site. The structure was well built by frontier standards, constructed 3 years earlier using solid logs and competent notching. Webb had chinked it carefully and built a functional fireplace. The cabin had kept him alive through multiple winters without serious problems, but this storm exceeded the structure's capacity to provide adequate shelter. Wind drove through gaps in the chinking that had seemed minor during normal cold. Snow infiltrated around the door and through the rawhide window covering, creating drifts inside the cabin. The fireplace consumed wood at an alarming rate, yet interior temperature barely reached 20 degrees, even with a roaring fire. Webb burned through his carefully rationed firewood at 4 times his normal consumption. By the 3rd day of the storm, he had exhausted half his winter supply and still shivered violently, even while sitting directly beside the fire. Ice formed on the interior walls, where condensation from his breath froze instantly. Water in his cooking pot froze solid, despite being positioned near the fireplace. His hands became clumsy with cold, making even simple tasks like splitting kindling dangerously difficult. He wore every piece of clothing he owned, layer upon layer, and still felt the cold penetrating to his core. Other trappers scattered across the region faced similar crises. Silas Drummond, a younger Irish trapper whose cabin stood along a different creek system, watched his firewood supply vanish with terrifying speed. His cabin leaked air from a dozen sources he had never noticed during milder weather. The storm found every weakness, every gap, every poorly fitted joint. Men who had considered themselves adequately prepared discovered that adequate was nowhere near sufficient. The storm had created conditions where standard frontier construction simply could not maintain survivable interior temperature regardless of how much wood was burned. On the 4th day of the blizzard, Obadiah Webb made a desperate decision. His firewood supply was nearly exhausted, his cabin was barely warmer than the exterior, and the storm showed no signs of breaking. He had 2 choices: remain in his failing shelter and likely freeze to death, or attempt to reach another trapper's cabin and hope for hospitality. The journey would be dangerous, possibly fatal, but staying guaranteed slow death. He chose movement. He wrapped himself in every fur and blanket he could carry, loaded his rifle, and set out toward Nils Anderson's cliff cabin. The 4-mile journey took 6 hours of brutal struggle through waist-deep snow in whiteout conditions. Webb arrived at the cliff base in late afternoon, nearly frozen and barely able to walk. He could see smoke rising from Nils's chimney, steady and thin, not the thick pour that came from desperate fires consuming excessive wood. He climbed the slope to the cabin and pounded on the door with numb fists. Nils opened it immediately and pulled Webb inside. The transition was so extreme that Webb stood motionless for several seconds, unable to process what his body was experiencing. The interior was genuinely warm, comfortably warm, the kind of warmth that seemed impossible during the conditions raging outside. Nils stripped the frozen outer layers from Webb's clothing and sat him near the fireplace. The fire was modest, no larger than a normal cooking fire, yet the cabin maintained temperature that felt tropical compared to what Webb had endured for 4 days. As sensation returned to his extremities and his shivering gradually subsided, Webb examined the interior with growing incomprehension. The thermometer mounted on the wall read 61 degrees. 61 degrees while exterior temperature was negative 32, while the blizzard consumed cabins and wood supplies across the entire region, while men froze in structures that should have protected them. Nils explained quietly what Webb was experiencing. The stone stored heat during the day and released it at night. The massive overhang eliminated most heat loss surfaces. The careful construction prevented air infiltration. The result was a structure that required minimal fire to maintain comfort even during extreme cold. Webb listened but struggled to accept the explanation. The performance exceeded anything he had believed possible. 2 days later, Silas Drummond arrived in similar condition to Webb's earlier state. His cabin had become uninhabitable, his wood supply depleted. Nils took him in as well. The 3 men lived in the cliff cabin for the remaining 3 days of the blizzard. Nils burned wood at his normal modest rate. Interior temperature never dropped below 58 degrees. The contrast between the comfortable refuge and the deadly conditions outside created a stark demonstration that no amount of explanation could have achieved. Webb and Drummond were living proof that Nils's design was not incrementally better than standard construction. It was categorically different. A fundamental reimagining of how frontier shelter could function in extreme environments. The blizzard finally broke on January 21st after 7 days of sustained fury. The sky cleared to reveal a landscape transformed by snow accumulation that exceeded 4 feet in most areas. Temperature remained brutally cold, negative 28 degrees under clear skies. Trappers across the region emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. Several men had abandoned their cabins entirely during the worst of the storm, seeking shelter with partners or in communal structures. Others had burned through their entire winter wood supply and now faced the remaining months without adequate fuel. The storm had exposed the inadequacy of standard frontier construction with brutal clarity. Lachlan McTavish appeared at Nils's cabin on the afternoon of January 22nd. McTavish was a Scottish trapper in his 50s who operated a small trading post in addition to his trap lines. He was known for his meticulous record-keeping and his possession of unusual equipment, including a precision mercury thermometer he had brought from Edinburgh years earlier. McTavish had heard from other trappers that Webb and Drummond had survived the blizzard in Nils's cliff cabin and that the structure had performed remarkably well. He wanted to verify the reports with actual measurements. Nils welcomed him inside and showed him the thermometer mounted on the cabin wall. McTavish examined it, noted the reading of 63 degrees, then produced his own instrument from a carefully padded case. The 2 thermometers agreed within 1 degree, confirming accuracy. McTavish then stepped outside and took an exterior reading, negative 28 degrees. He walked down to Webb's abandoned cabin, now cold and uninhabitable, and took a reading there. With no fire for 3 days, the interior had equalized with exterior temperature. 9 degrees, barely above the outside air, proving that the cabin structure itself provided almost no insulation or heat retention. McTavish returned to the cliff cabin and requested permission to document his findings. Nils agreed. McTavish recorded 3 measurements in his journal with precise notation: exterior temperature, negative 28 degrees, standard cabin interior, 9 degrees, cliff cabin interior, 63 degrees. The mathematical comparison was irrefutable. Nils's cabin maintained interior temperature 91 degrees warmer than exterior, while Webb's cabin managed only 37 degrees of differential, and that only with massive fire consumption. But the critical comparison was between the two inhabited structures. Nils's cabin was 63 degrees warmer than Webb's had been before abandonment, a difference that represented the gap between comfort and death. McTavish asked detailed questions about construction methods, materials, and thermal theory. Nils explained the stone's heat storage properties, the reduced surface area for heat loss, and the elimination of air infiltration. McTavish understood immediately. His Scottish upbringing had included stone cottages that used similar principles, though never applied to frontier conditions. He asked permission to share the information with other trappers. Nils agreed without hesitation. The crisis had proven the concept. There was no longer any reason for secrecy. Word of the cliff cabin's performance traveled through the trapping community with the speed of truly valuable information. Lachlan McTavish discussed the temperature measurements at his trading post, showing his journal entries to every trapper who passed through. Obadiah Webb and Silas Drummond shared their first-hand experiences of surviving the blizzard in comfort while their own cabins failed. The story grew with each retelling, but the core facts remained consistent and verifiable. Nils Anderson had built a structure that maintained interior temperature 63 degrees warmer than standard cabins, using a fraction of the firewood. The initial response was widespread disbelief among trappers who had not witnessed the performance directly. The claimed differential seemed impossible, too extreme to be credible. But as more men visited the cliff site and experienced the interior warmth themselves, skepticism transformed into urgent interest. Men whose cabins had barely kept them alive during the blizzard wanted to understand how Nils had achieved such dramatic improvement. The questions focused on practical details. Where had he found suitable cliff formations? What specific techniques had he used for sealing logs to stone? How had he prevented smoke accumulation under the overhang? How much had the specialized materials cost? Nils shared his knowledge freely and completely. He explained the importance of south-facing orientation for maximum sun exposure. He described his chinking mixture and how to prepare it properly. He demonstrated the pinned corner technique and the reasoning behind extending logs past joints. He discussed thermal mass principles in terms that men without formal education could understand. "Stone holds heat like a water barrel holds water," he would say. "The bigger the barrel, the more it can store. The thicker the stone, the longer it holds warmth." The explanations were simple but accurate enough to convey the essential concepts. By spring of 1844, several trappers had begun searching for suitable cliff sites in their territories. The search was not always successful. Sandstone overhangs with the necessary characteristics were geographically limited. Some regions had granite or limestone formations that lacked the ideal thermal properties. Other areas had no significant cliff formations at all. But in regions where appropriate geology existed, trappers began staking claims to cliff sites with the same intensity they had previously reserved for beaver-rich creek systems. A good overhang became valuable territory. Silas Drummond was the first to complete a cliff cabin based on Nils's design. His structure was smaller and less refined than the original, but it incorporated the essential principles: stone back wall and roof. Careful log fitting, specialized chinking, tight door construction. Drummond completed it in autumn of 1844 and reported during the following winter that his firewood consumption had dropped by more than half while his comfort had increased dramatically. His success encouraged others. Over the next 3 years, approximately a dozen cliff cabins were built across the northern Rocky Mountain region wherever suitable geology could be found. The phrase, "built like Anderson's cliff shelter," entered the local vocabulary as shorthand for construction that prioritized thermal efficiency and durability over speed and convenience. The innovation spread organically, shared freely among men who recognized genuine improvement when they experienced it. Nils Anderson left the mountains in 1849, part of the general exodus as the fur trade collapsed and new opportunities drew men westward. He had accumulated modest wealth during his trapping years and invested it in a small ranch in Oregon Territory near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1851 a widow named Ingrid Halverson, who had emigrated from Norway with her first husband. They raised 3 children on the ranch, growing wheat and raising cattle in the fertile valley. Nils adapted to settled life with the same methodical competence he had brought to wilderness survival. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about his mountain years, and died in 1871 at age 62. His cliff cabin remained occupied long after his departure. A prospector named Coleman used it during the brief gold rush period of the 1850s. A homesteading family lived in it through the 1860s, adding a second room and using the original structure as the core of a larger dwelling. By the 1870s, the cabin had become a recognized way station for travelers moving through the region. The stone-backed portion remained solid and weatherproof, while wooden additions built by later occupants deteriorated and required replacement. The contrast illustrated the durability advantage Nils had understood decades earlier. The technique he had pioneered continued spreading in modified forms. Settlers moving into regions with suitable geology incorporated cliff overhangs into their homestead designs. Mining camps in mountainous areas used natural rock formations as structural elements. The United States Army's frontier forts occasionally positioned critical buildings against cliff faces for defensive and thermal advantages. The specific connection to Nils Anderson was gradually lost as the technique became common knowledge, but the principles he had proven remained embedded in frontier construction practices wherever geography permitted their application. Modern historians researching frontier shelter design have identified at least 30 structures built between 1845 and 1875 that show clear evidence of cliff integration for thermal efficiency. The actual number was likely higher, as many remote structures were never formally documented. Conservative estimates suggest the technique saved several dozen lives during extreme weather events over those decades. Men survived blizzards and cold snaps that would have killed them in standard cabins. The mathematics were straightforward. A structure that maintained survivable temperature with minimal fuel consumption allowed men to endure conditions that overwhelmed conventional shelter. The story of Nils Anderson's cliff cabin illustrates a broader truth about frontier innovation. The most valuable advances often came from practical problem-solving rather than theoretical knowledge. A Swedish trapper with basic carpentry skills and careful observation had achieved results that formally trained architects might have dismissed as impossible. He had recognized that partnership with geology could accomplish what pure carpentry could not. He had understood that massive thermal mass and reduced heat loss surface area would create exponential improvements over incremental refinements to standard methods. Most importantly, he had proven his concept through direct measurement and crisis validation, transforming mockery into adoption through undeniable evidence. His legacy was carved not in words but in stone and logs, in structures that outlasted their builder, standing as silent testimony to what knowledge and determination could accomplish on the American frontier.